in the context of the United States, those three areas of military, marriage, higher education, or education writ large are really helpful grounds to explore how people have had limited access to, if we're going to understand equality as having the unfettered access to an individual's capacity to live a life with dignity and with their capacity to make their own choices. Over the history of the United States, access to those institutions has been limited on the basis of people's identities. And importantly, what we also notice is that there is an ebb and flow to what those changes look like. So, to give you the example of marriage across genders, um, the Defense of Marriage Act from '96, originally at the federal level, defined it as only between a man and a woman. In 2013, that was challenged and struck down at the Supreme Court level. Um, and then ultimately, most recently with Obergefell, it was now then inclusive of not just restricted to a man and a woman, but open to all genders. That is now with the current federal administration again at risk, and we sort of see this in some of the current state level legislation. And I think that what's something that's important is that that definition of equality doesn't just shift at the federal level, but also at the state level. We've seen that as well with the military, with the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2010 and 2011, and now most recently with the start of the second administration of Trump, um, we now see the very explicit exclusion of trans military members. So the way in which the regulation of sexuality, the regulation of gender identity and expression happens in the military is also something that I think is contingent on who is sort of occupying power. And I think most recently, and what is perhaps most germane to my area of work, is the field of education, where we've certainly had, in the context of the US, a history of at one moment thinking that separate was sufficient to be considered equal, then to a process of integration, now to a quite compelling social science evidence that talks about the increase in resegregation at the K-12 level, and most recently, the current levels of attacks on the use of affirmative action, the very consideration of race as an element that can be considered in selective admissions processes has now been undermined with the most recent Supreme Court decision. So this whole concept of equality, I think, is very much historically contingent. And I think in the context of the US, we sort of see this back and forth of who gets to be a full participant of civic society. This point of how is it that we can somehow claim to be interested in equality or in ideas of fairness, and then mobilizing that rhetoric to actually undermine those principles is something that I'm incredibly curious about, very committed to better understanding systematically through research.